Inspirational Creatives, episode 279.
Where to begin?
Always tricky, isn't it? The beginning bit is tricky.
Yeah, once you get into it.
Welcome to Inspirational Creatives. I'm your host, Rob Lawrence. Join me every Friday as I chat with successful artists, producers, and creative entrepreneurs who share powerful stories and strategies. They can help you to create the life that you want. Listen each week as these inspirational creatives show you how to take your creativity to the next level. You'll learn how to create a sustainable business that inspires others and gives you the financial freedom and lifestyle that you want. Thanks for listening. Make sure you sign up at inspirationalcreatives.com to get free exclusive bonus material. And now, on with the show. Rob here, and a warm welcome to Inspirational Creatives. Today I'm going to share with you another very special episode as part of the Bringing It Home series, which marks 5 years of Inspirational Creatives, featuring artists and creative entrepreneurs right from here on my doorstep in Norwich, England. In today's episode, I'm very excited to share with you part 2 of my chat with painter and ex-theatre director John Link, who happens to be based in a studio opposite my own right here in the heart of the city. In part 1 of my chat with John, in episode 277, we talked about John's journey and how and what his creative process has taught him about life and living as a practicing creative. In this episode, part 2 of my chat with John, we talk about death, creativity, and the importance of vulnerability as a creative. And by the way, if you haven't yet caught part 1 of our chat, head on over to inspirationalcreatives.com, click on the episodes button and have a look for episode 277. I was recently asked which has been my favourite interview in the entire series so far, and it's a tough question to answer because it all depends on your perspective. But I have to say that this has been one of the most meaningful chats that I've had on the series, and for me, I feel that John and I really get into some of the important issues and fundamentals of living a creative life, which sum up a number of the themes and principles which underlie the entire series. This conversation, as you'll hear, is more or less unedited, so in a sense I hope you can join John and I live, separated only by time and space, so to speak, through the medium of recording, from his studio here in Norwich. It's quite a different interview from the ones you'd normally expect on this series, so I hope it's a refreshing change of pace and tone for you. In this second part of our conversation, John and I talk about his recent near-death experience and how that has affected his relationship to his painting and the work that he does. And as I mentioned, we look more closely at the importance of being vulnerable as an artist. We also discuss, amongst other themes, the importance of play, even though we perhaps at times take our creative work very seriously. As always, I'd love to hear what you think about this episode. I hope you enjoy it as much as I have done recording it, so feel free to drop me a line at rob@inspirationalcreatives.com. And now, John Link.
Tell me about the painting that's sat on your easel right now. Is this an old or is this a
It's
a
an
new
old
painting?
one. Well, by old, I mean about three or 4 years old. So, yeah, pretty old, really. A play Shakespeare's called A Winter's Tale. And it's Hermione, the main female protagonist, and her son Mamilius. And this particular painting is about a moment in her life where she's contemplating actually quite a bleak future at the moment, clinging to her son. She's also pregnant, as it happens. And her husband has violently rejected her in the mistaken belief that she's having an affair with his best friend. So he being king and all-powerful and male and all of that, has banished her, in fact sent her to prison for what he perceives to be adulterous behaviour. And so this is a moment where she's sitting contemplating her life, which is kind of falling apart. And the setting is, I mean, she's sitting on an enormous kind of sofa, really, but the sort of wallpaper around her is peeling away, and there's a kind of floating window frame with a rather bleak, almost wintry scene outside of trees, spindly trees. So it's a fairly kind of bleak situation. The problem I'm having with it at the moment is that the bleak bit is fine, but one wants to also try and find something a bit more redemptive and positive in the painting. And so that's what I'm struggling with at the moment, is trying to not lose the general feeling that is of kind of melancholy and so on, but also to feel that there is some potential for the future as well. So it's not doom and gloom. Melancholy maybe, but not miserable. And at the moment it's looking a bit miserable. So a bit of colour, a bit of lightening up of the whole thing, I think might do the trick. It all ultimately rests in the expression in the eyes, really, and of course I'm still tinkering with that. And it was because it's an old picture, it's kind of difficult. I've retained the basic shape of the faces, but I'm in the process of reworking the features to give her gaze a bit less miserable. The little boy on her lap is perfectly happy, actually. He's kind of having fun. It's his birthday. And he's kind of, at the moment, not particularly involved in the trauma that's gone on with the parents. Little do we know, of course, in very short order, the little boy contracts some illness. We don't quite know what, but it's traumatic. And he, in fact, does die, which adds another element of unhappiness into the mix. However, at this point in time, we're not there yet. That's looking ahead a bit. So looking ahead, which is what we all do, really, I suppose. We look to tomorrow. We look to what's going to come next, what's going to happen next in our life, given what we have gone through, which is our past. And of course, the past is a journey we've travelled, and therefore our past, which is mingled in with memory, is something we know. We've been there. I mean, sometimes we choose to block it out. Sometimes we choose to reject it. Nevertheless, we've been there, done it, and in a sense got the T-shirt. So that's kind of where we've come from. Our childhood, our education, our peer groups, our career choices, whatever they are, have brought us to this point. And this point being the point at which we then look to tomorrow. Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? And that's really what the painting is about as well.
It may be an obvious question, but I'd love to get a deeper insight as to what inspired you at the time to begin this painting.
What inspired me is what always really inspires me, because I have this passion, are Shakespeare's plays and stories. He has an extraordinary insight into human nature. He deals with issues that are very contemporary, I believe, at any given time through the ages. He's always been very contemporary. And it's no accident to know that even now, in this sort of extraordinary time we're living through now, that there are something like 4 or 5 Shakespeare productions on in London and around. I mean, he's always current. There's always a Shakespeare play somewhere. None of which he was banking on or planning for, but if we were around now, he'd be the richest man on the planet. But so my inspiration comes from really that. And also, we know very little about the man himself, historically. Little bits of hints here and there in the plays and from contemporaries, but really, we don't know much. I mean, there is even controversy about, from some quarters, whether he actually wrote the plays, whether it's, Anyway, does that matter? The plays exist. But what I have also at the back of my mind is this man in 1540, whenever it was, or that period of time, sitting in a garret somewhere by candlelight, trying to make a living as an actor, stroke writer, beginning to write because he could see that writing, if he could crack it, would bring him a bit more dosh, and he was very ambitious. How good an actor he was, we don't know, but he acted for some years. successfully in a very successful group. And then he started writing plays. But the astonishing thing for me is, and what I find kind of inspiring at the core of this, is that this man wrote alone in lodgings somewhere in south of the river in London, presumably, by candlelight. And he wrote these plays with a feather, with a quill, scratching away. No computers, literally burning the midnight oil with a kind of passion and a kind of energy and a kind of vigor and a kind of determination and a sense, I think, probably must have grown in him that he had something to say as well. And that all coalescing in this extraordinary period of time, which is about 10 or 12 years, where he wrote 37 plays and 130 odd sonnets. Mozartian, really. And that I find extraordinarily inspiring. That man, who I assume existed, and anyway, I'm happy to take the story on board. And that, I think, gives the lie to the plays. It creates an extraordinary energy in the writing, sometimes a kind of fury. Sometimes the writing goes haywire. Sometimes you see he's taking a story to a certain place and then he thinks, oh God, I've got to bring this to a conclusion somehow. I'm writing, So he'd kind of make jumps and changes and shifts, and sometimes the plays go, oh, but it doesn't matter because in a sense that's also human nature. We make those kind of jumps sometimes. So to answer your question rather long-windedly, that's what inspires me. Then there are the stories themselves, the simple narratives about people struggling to make sense of the mess they've got themselves in, whether it's comedic or whether it's, tragic, whether it's Hamlet or Lear or Othello or whether it's Midsummer Night's Dream or Twelfth Night or whatever, whether it's the histories, Richard III, Richard II, the Henrys and so on. Doesn't matter. They're all kind of looking at the same issues from very different standpoints, political and personal, familial and social. But again, coming back always to something very simple and very solitary and my paintings tend to be about solo people, single people. Sometimes there's a second character involved, as there is with this current painting with the child, but fundamentally the story is in the central character. And so my characters are alone with their issues and problems and their discussions with themselves about where to go next, what road do I take, how do I get rid of the mess I'm in, and so on. So that's it. But hopefully the paintings in themselves are not too miserable.
What is it about the individuals that draws you to them?
The vulnerability, I think. Whether they be kings, queens, or whether they be kind of ordinary folk. I think what draws me to them is their complete vulnerability and their desperate attempt in some way to resolve the issues of being vulnerable, which again is what we all do. I mean, we develop mechanisms to protect ourselves against being hurt or being taken advantage of or so on. So I think vulnerability. But I think what's interesting is that in that territory is where core things happen in terms of human endeavour. Mm-hmm. Out of that vulnerability comes, not always successful solutions, but always something that is interesting which adds to the story. So I always found that working with actors, when I was working with actors, an actor's most powerful weapon is his vulnerability. That ability to strip himself of any protective gloss as an individual and allow his inner self to connect with whatever he or she is trying to do with the play, the character, whatever. That's not easy, because we think, oh, actors, they just put on a funny hat or a funny face and they're all very confident and so on, cocky and able to cope. They're actually not, most of them. And the ones that don't have that quality are more often than not terribly interesting actors. Maybe very successful. That's a whole different ballgame. And the world is full of actors or performers and painters and musicians who are kind of pretty crap, but very, very successful. So that's a different kind of measure we're in. But for me, the really classy, the really good writers, the really good actors, the really good musicians, the really good painters are the ones that kind of can allow that inner thing to connect. So there's nothing much different from painting a picture than creating a character in the space with an actor or telling a story.
In terms of your own painting practice, how has that affected your vulnerability? Has that allowed you to explore it, become more vulnerable?
I think when I started painting, because I'm kind of what's euphemistically known as self-taught, that's not entirely true. Of course, because we pick up stuff. What I mean is I never went to art school and I never learned a particular technique. But I have been taught by the masters, or who I consider masters, by going to galleries and so on and so forth, and by watching painters work and by reading about painters and so on. So self-taught is a kind of bit of a euphemism, really. But I had no formal training as an artist. So how does that inform my... well, I suppose there's a kind... I hope in the work there's a kind of honesty in the work. I try not to get engaged with outcomes, the end product. I mean, clearly there's a sense in which one is aiming for something. But one can't tell the end of the story till you've told the beginning, if you see what I mean. So there's a kind of journey, there's a kind of process. And it's quite interesting working with actors, because often the actor wants certainty. He wants to know, he wants to be secure. So he will tend instinctively and intuitively to go for outcomes. How will I look? How will I be? Will this be successful? There's things that attach themselves to the end product. And the task is to allow the journey to happen. And of course, when you read a play, you know the end of the play, so in a sense the actor's got to forget that. And there's a kind of sense in which the actor subliminally enters into a contract with the audience, ultimately, who return that compliance by entering into the world of fantasy and make-believe, and a pretense of what's happening in the space is fresh, new and spontaneous, and they're making it up as they go along. So it's dealing with the rationale that is solid and secure in most of us, and dealing with fantasy and pretense and make-believe and wonder.
In terms of your own character and who you are in the world today, does it give you a confidence that your painting practice, or a form of, obviously a form of expression, but I'm interested to know how it affects you in terms of your relationship with life? Let's look at it that way.
It's given me a fresh excitement about being alive, because it's a relatively new career, the painting bit, because it came about by accident. There was no plan to be a painter, although I've always diddly-dooed with a pencil over time. but there was never a plan for me to become a painter. I was doing other things, working with actors or whatever, programs or plays from a different place. So paintings give me a fresh excitement about investigating who we are, who I am, to a certain extent, of course, because my paintings reflect me to a certain extent. And in fact, a lot of people say my paintings all look like me. I don't know if that's quite true, but maybe there's an element of that in me.
Yeah.
I mean, by nature, I suppose I'm fairly light-hearted. I mean, I'm very much an optimist. I enjoy and love laughter and silliness. And what we do when we are creating is, in a sense, all rather silly. If you like, it's childish. I mean, what is different from what I do from what a child does with a crayon? You know, it's that same sense of connecting with something that's innate and to do with playing and to do with being alive and being disorganized and so on. A child exists in that world. They exist in the moment all the time. They're not conscious of a past. They're not particularly engaged with a future, although they may be going to a movie or going to a birthday party or something, but it's all very kind of in the moment for a child. As we grow older, that kind of stretches into a different set of dimensions, and we become more conscious of past and indeed more conscious of future, which I've already sort of touched on, really. So I think it's what I do is fun. I'm very fortunate to be able to have fun and sometimes to be able to share the results of my having fun with other people who have the temerity to put their hands in their pockets and write a check. So I make a living of sorts. And I'm terribly fortunate in that. Sometimes, of course, it's not quite as easy as that, but I'm very lucky. I'm not a struggling artist in a garret with nothing to eat. You know, I mean, I just tick over. But fundamentally, it's about playing, and it's about having, I think, a sense of the futility and the ridiculousness and the silliness. It's, I think, also no accident. Currently, we're living in what might be termed troubled times. Perhaps we're always in troubled times, but it seems at the moment to do with the planet hurtling towards some kind of ecological disaster. Nationalism, politics, anger, fear is rife at the moment, and people are striking out and hitting out politicians, or businessmen are being greedy. It's about control, it's about all those things. And we need laughter, we need fun, we need joy, we need stories, we need to connect again with simplicity and to a certain extent, I suppose that's what I'm currently doing allows me to do. And having a sense that, well, however blustery we are, at the end of the day, strip it all off, we're still kind of fairly vulnerable people, you know. I don't particularly want to visualise Donald Trump with no kit on, but do you know what I mean? He's actually as weak and vulnerable as I am when I'm in the bathroom. Do you know, we're all the same. It's also no accident, I think, that in these particular times there is a huge growth, for example, of stand-up comedians, of people who are standing up alone in the space with a microphone and telling stories about themselves or about the world around them or whatever, how they're relating to it. It's astonishing how many, mostly youngish, it's a relatively new in terms of the explosion in the world of comedy. And I find that very, very interesting and rather exciting, because there's a kind of fearlessness about stand-up, which is what attracts me, a kind of vulnerability. Anybody who stands up in front of a group of people in a darkened room with a spotlight on them is either going to die 1,000 deaths or... So they're in that place, which brings me back to my painting and my characters, really. So that I find fascinating.
Actually, what I'd like to ask you, if you're comfortable talking about, we're lucky enough to share the same building, and I was aware of your absence more recently, and I know you've been poorly.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
You know, your poorliness, and what I'm particularly interested in, and you know, let's give our listeners some context of what you've been through from a medical point of view. But what I'm also interested in too is how that experience has changed you, and maybe may have changed your relationship with your work.
Absolutely. Huge is the answer, really, I think. Yes, I mean, I've all my life been incredibly fortunate in terms of health and other things, but I've always been a kind of healthy guy, and kind of sport and stuff, and keeping healthy and fit and eating. I've never been I had my moments in the 60s when we played with the weed and bits and pieces, but by and large, you know, led what you'd consider to be a reasonably healthy life. And then suddenly, out of the blue, had some sudden symptoms, very suddenly and kind of unexpected, an inability to digest food and so on. I won't bore you with the details, but it suddenly became apparent that I had something wrong. So I went into hospital for a checkup, accident emergency. And they said, we need to do something quite drastic, quite urgently, which they did. So a man with a knife came along and dug into me and dug stuff out. I had 2 major hits, actually. And it was a time where suddenly everything went black and dark and painful. In a way, much more emotionally difficult for my wife and family to deal with, because for 2 or 3 days after the operation, they had no idea whether I was going to live or die. So it was pretty profound what I went through. I, of course, was in the middle of the storm, and most of the time unconscious, so not really aware of very much going on, until I got into the sort of slow recovery process. Anyway, went through all that. Difficulties of, I couldn't walk, I couldn't eat, lots of things I had to relearn. I had no taste, I had no smell, I was lying in a hospital bed with tubes everywhere, kind of conscious but floating in this kind of in-between place. Anyway, little by little, I got better, and then I went home, and then I learned to walk again, and blah, 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 blah. So it was a kind of, I suppose, what might be termed a near-death experience. How did it change me? Well, it kind of profoundly, because suddenly I was confronted with mortality, and also confronted with the notion that actually I kind of wasn't ready to go, because I felt I still had stuff to do, I don't know, in me. I don't know how much mankind would benefit from me being around longer, but that is neither here nor there. I didn't want to move on in that way at this point in time. So I it filled me with an extraordinary kind of determination, personally, to survive, to get better. And support from my family was profound in that process, and friends who were extraordinarily loving and positive and helpful and so on. And little by little, I'm walking again. I'm not quite running, but I'm bicycling, I'm driving, I'm back leading, quotes, normal life, but still in recovery. It's going to take a year or so to get fully recovered, if I'm allowed to fully recover. What it meant was, the recovery process posed a number of questions. I suppose the main one was to do with the notion of chemotherapy. The technicians, the surgical technicians, the doctors, all wanted, in my case, to drench me in chemo. There are, as I'm sure you're aware, profound side effects that are very debilitating. I was in a weak physical state. I had a stoma in, which is a sort of temporary colostomy thing. I had a heart attack when I was under the knife in the operating, apparently. So I wasn't physically strong. And the oncologist was becoming more and more aware of this, that my vulnerability, my physical vulnerability, might not receive kindly the notion of chemo. Nevertheless, it was a choice. And they were kind of basically felt that although they had removed stuff, there was a chance there was still stuff sloshing about, and they wanted to zap it. The percentage chances of success using chemo, once I looked at the statistics offered, weren't wildly encouraging. And then I thought, well, quality of life. I had paintings I wanted to paint. I had work I wanted to do with young actors still and so on. And the chemo would have prevented all that. He said to me at one point, well, of course you won't be able to hold a paintbrush. I thought, hello. That's not terribly fun. So after some longish discussion, principally between myself and my wife, but also with the doctors, I said no to chemo, for the time being anyway, and take another route, which of course, again, the medical profession are not wildly happy about. But I decided to go the sort of, if you like, the nature, the homeopathic route, not because I think that offers me a cure. I don't think it does, and the people I'm working with now are not making any claims that there is the cure. But what they can actually do, and this is actually scientific, they can provide me with if you like, a diet which allows me to build up principally my immune system, quite apart from my general well-being, principally my immune system, which is what chemo destroys. And my immune system is actually organically the strongest weapon against cancer, because if my immune system is very strong and I eat or I deny myself certain foods which we know encourage the cancer, if we can deny the cancer its food, it won't grow. That's where we're at. That's a little battle I'm engaged in at the moment. And I'm feeling, since I've been on this diet, I suppose you call it, I'm feeling physically strong. I'm putting on weight. As I said earlier, I'm now pretty well fully active, except I can't really run for a bus. But to come back to your other question, how did it affect me? What it has done is created in me a whole new kind of energy and a kind of sense of making the most of something that I had to a certain extent taken for granted. So, it may sound a bit corny or cheesy, but each day is an exciting event. That I can come into my playroom, my Wendy house, and tinker and play and have fun with pots of paint. And it's given me a fresh appreciation of my family, of those I love, of my friends, my life, an appreciation of how unbelievably fortunate I've been. not in terms of gathering wealth, but in terms of having a life that's been incredibly rich and an awful lot of the time a lot of fun. And so what's it's done? It's rather than knock me off my perch, it's put me back on my perch very firmly and said, get on with it, boy. Give it a good swing, you know.
Yeah.
So that's really what it's done. It's sharpened me, and I'm in the sort of, one might term the twilight years of my life, but I don't feel that at all. I feel like a 30-year-old. And I feel I'm looking in a funny kind of way to a future. The reality is quite different, but sod the reality. You know,
Yes.
I'm not up for that.
Yeah.
I'm up for the game of playing, of enjoying and of making the most of what I do. And I've been so much more prolific since I got back on my feet again. I mean, in the last month, 5, maybe 6 weeks, I've been sort of started painting again. I've created 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, at least a dozen paintings, which would have, I would have been lucky to have done 3 probably over that period. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm kind of working like a mad thing. My poor wife is having to suffer that to a certain extent, because I come here and play and she's at home, although she's starting to work again, which is good, actually. In fact, got a batch of work this week, which has been a wonderful week this week for her. So that's really what it's done. It's rejuvenated me in a way that is quite extraordinary. I'm starting work with young actors in a week's time, doing a Shakespeare workshop for 6 weeks in London. And I can't wait to get down there, you know, with these kids and get to grips with what I do in my studio. It's the same context, really, but with aspiring young actors who are hoping to make their mark in some way. And I'm hoping to be able to inspire them a bit, you know, to have fun, to celebrate who we are, who they are. That's what we have to learn to do. We have to celebrate ourselves. We are extraordinary. I mean, how many millions are there in the world? Billions of us. And we're all different. There's the odd doppelganger, I suppose, around the place, but by and large we are all different. Even twins, even identical twins. Apparently, it was interesting, I was reading last week about it, that in one of the colour supplements, as I do, that's how I learn about the world. And even apparently now, with all the research they've done on identical twins, the differences are quite profound. So that I find remarkable. Ergo, what I'm about, in my little corner of this extraordinary world, is about celebrating that individuality. And that's what I'm trying to encourage in young actors, and it's what I try to encourage in myself now. Be who you want to be. That's not to do with make lots of money or celebrity or change the world, but be who you want to be and celebrate that. Don't try to be what you think other people want you to be. Challenge. And that hasn't to do with throwing bombs. It has to do with saying, I believe this, I want to do this, I'm going to do this. Somehow, either like that or like that, doesn't matter. Maybe that's naive, I don't know. But that's my survival message, I guess. And we do to others as we would do unto ourselves. And because I've had this extraordinary, unfortunate but fortunate experience, has created an enormous positivity about the sanctity of life, about being alive. You know? And that's what this is all about, really. If I can earn an odd shilling, I'm happy to do that as well. But one's needs, boiled down, are not as great as we often think they are. Of course, we get trapped into a way of life. We buy a house, we get a mortgage, we have kids, we have responsibilities. That kind of stretches things a bit. And so we can't always just do our own thing. But within that family situation, I believe we still have to try to be who we are and share that with the little ones and with relatives, with friends, and so on. And not everybody can be Prime Minister, not everybody can be Matisse or whatever. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. What matters is you sniff the air and you kind of see the sunlight, or you see a tree, or you see a bird, or you see a child laughing, or you see, I don't know, the wonder of life, wonder of being. I have no sort of arty-farty thing about this. It's, for me, terribly simple. We hunt for words to express ourselves because words are not all we have, but to a large extent, and they're incredibly inadequate. What I love about Shakespeare, I'll come back to him again, I suppose, he introduced something like 1800 new words into the language, which we still use unconsciously. We don't know. Do you know? But I think that's magical as well. Magical. And the wonderful thing about him is he was working. Yes, he was ambitious. Yes, he was trying to earn a living. Yes, he wanted to make his mark, but he was working alone, celebrating himself. He wasn't writing for posterity, for libraries, for scholarship. He never actually published a play in his lifetime. It was friends 10, 15 years after his death that brought together the fragments of plays and created the folios. He would go in each day to work, to rehearsal, with 3 pages, or whatever it was. That's today's bit. None of the actors ever read the play. They just read their bits. And they made it together. They put it together. It was never... He wasn't writing for posterity, for what the world may think 10 years ahead. Now. And that, I think, also it connects with the kind of vitality in the writing. Why is a great writer? People go, oh, Shakespeare, oh, yeah, because scholarship has fucked it up, basically. It's made it the playground of the intellectual. And to a certain extent, justified. But how many books are written about Shakespeare? What he means? He wasn't offering us any answers. If you look for answers in the play, you won't get them. He was posing questions. It's up to us to find the answer. And scholarship is about finding answers in the plays. What does he mean when he says that? He probably didn't know half of it himself. So I'm kind of a bit anti-scholarship in a way. Maybe that's because I never went to school. Well, I did go to school, but I left school when I was 14 and a half. I never went to university, so I've always approached the plays anyway when I became aware of them from a different place. But I just think we've become, in our education system, rooted in looking for meanings in the play, the teaching of Shakespeare in schools is dense and obfuscating and, in the main, not always, in the main, unenlightening. But if you can introduce the stories to the kids, they come alive. Kids respond to Shakespeare big time if they engage with the stories and not with the hidden meanings. And the stories of the plays are in themselves, in us. We're all, in that sense, like Shakespearean characters. That's it, really.
Just before we wrap up, as I scan your studio, which I find a fascinating place to be, and there's lots full of imagery, in one corner you've got a little piece of writing that I can read from here. It says, "I still believe."
Yeah.
What does that mean to you? Just out of curiosity.
It's a reaffirmation of what I've been talking about, I think. I still believe. It's about not letting go, not giving up, not saying I've had enough. Please stop hurting me, bothering me, worrying me, creating problems for me. Fuck it, go out there and do it. It's also about dealing with the bully boys, whether it's the bank manager or the mortgage broker or my next door neighbour or our political people. Yeah, that's what that's about, I guess. And it's what's embodied in... I've been very fortunate with my chums, really. And that spirit is embodied in a number of my chums who encourage it, who support it. And who, in a way, have supported me through this period of time, particularly. And one or two of them buy my paintings, which is fabulous.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Yeah.
Brilliant.
I hope that's given you something to play with.
Thank you so much,
Because
John.
play you must.
Yes, indeed. This is play. This is great.
Go away and tinker and play with your
Yeah,
thingamybobs.
absolutely.
I
Thank
ought
you,
to
John.
wobble off now because
Yeah, of course.
I need to go and meet up with my dearly beloved, without whom I could not, would not have survived, frankly. But she likes a joke as well, so that's good. We laugh a lot.
Good. Well, thank you so much, John.
All right, boy. Great pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Nothing beats the stories and advice of an expert to help you raise your creative game. I would love to know what you thought about today's episode, so don't forget to subscribe in iTunes, where you can rate and review the show. If you like this episode, I invite you to share it on Facebook or Twitter with the one person you know who will benefit from the wisdom shared here today. You can find the show notes on inspirationalcreatives.com/podcast. If you have a burning question or a great idea for a guest, head on over to inspirationalcreatives.com/contact, where you can connect with me there.
You start with a blank. Where to go?
Yeah. It's that first step. Okay, let's start with the painting you're working on right now.